This is Konstantin Gulish with Master's Thesis Defense here from Marymount University, Language and Literature Program. The chair of the thesis was Dr. Bess Fox, and the second reader was Dr. Sarah Fick. The presentation is titled Conversing Across the Divides, Social Constructionism, History of Distance Learning, and the Future of Online Composition Courses. This was also the title of my thesis. So at first, let me go ahead and give you a brief overview of the structure and organization of the thesis. And then we'll go ahead and go into specific practices of Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle that I believe are applicable for today's online composition courses. All right, so let's first of all cover a little bit of the current environment in terms of online learning and online education, specifically as it relates to composition, but also more broadly as well. So as I already said, that's the title. So the current environment, we can see that there is an editorial here in the New York Times, and basically talks about the fact that the current structure of online learning, such as the one used by the massive online open education courses, may not be the most appropriate way of dealing with online learning for introductory courses such as composition. The trend in online learning is that we have more and more students that are coming in online. Even during the recession years, when we had sort of steadying out of general enrollments in higher education, the enrollments in online courses continued to rise. So this is likely to continue to be the trend. As far as the demographics of online students go, this is particularly important because it relates to the demographics of the students that were enrolled in Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. As one might expect, we're looking at non-traditional students, students that sometimes are married, often have a job, and sometimes have one or more dependents. And this will be particularly important for that demographic in order to bring them into the academic community, the practices that we'll discuss later on. The sort of theoretical underpinnings of the project lies in social constructionism theory, right? And I'm particularly looking at two theorists which are relevant to composition courses, and that's of course David Bartholomew and Kenneth Bruffy. Both of them are looking at learning composition not merely as a technical skill, but learning it as a social practice within a certain social and cultural framework. Within that framework, that's what they're looking at, and we'll go more in that in terms of discussing the practices. The important thing about David Bartholomew is that for him, in order for somebody to write academic prose that's meaningful, it's important for them to not just simply learn the techniques, but also to feel as if they're part of that community, as if they're a member of the academic community writing for another member of the academic community. That's the meaningful part behind learning to write academic prose for Bartholomew. For Bruffy, the important thing that I take for Bruffy is the idea of writing as a separated form of conversation, as a sort of a form of conversation that's been processed through the written word. So that's the important pieces about those two theorists. And so the next important part here is the actual history of Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. Now in the paper I go into depth about the history of this school and organization, but here I'll just give you a brief overview. Chautauqua institution started out as a Sunday school training ground, and from that point on they advanced and they grew far beyond that. They expanded into various fields, and specifically they started the first distance learning. In that case it was by mail, distance learning education for humanities and liberal arts. And so this is important. It mimicked the traditional liberal arts college curriculum. And there is a video, and I'm not going to play it right now, but there is a video on YouTube from the archivist of the institution who describes this whole philosophy, which was one of the buildings specifically built for the meetings of Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, the meeting of that society that develops out of this distance education course. And so finally, we also look at tools of online learning and collaboration. And it's in these tools of online learning and collaboration that we can see how we can apply those to the practice. And there is three main aspects of this which I cover. One is the type of communication that's available for online learning students, because those are the two ways that we can have social collaboration, that we can have conversation in this, right? And that is the asynchronous, which is something that happens where each of us is sitting in our own space, in our own computers, at our own time. In other words, we don't have to be all at once. We leave messages, such as on message boards or email, and then we wait for somebody else to become part of that conversation later. The synchronous collaboration is different in the sense that it's real time. Two of us are sitting behind our computers or mobile devices at the same time. We are communicating either through chat or through web conferencing software, and we'll get into more details of that in the practices section of this presentation. There is, of course, variety of electronic communication that we can talk about, and again, we'll get more into that, some of the examples in the practices section. The other important thing that I think online learning brings that's different is the change in the role of the instructor in online courses. What I mean by that is traditional instructor is the center of the classroom. But in online, this can change. We can, in fact, have an instructor act more as a consultant, as an organizer of the course, but not necessarily directing every step. We can have students start taking over some of the responsibilities of the course for themselves. And we'll get a little bit into this, but that's a big idea here in terms of online learning for composition. Okay, so now we will go ahead and transition into the practices part of this presentation. Okay, so as you can see, this gives you the overview of the kinds of CLSC practices that we can discuss in terms of their application for online learning, especially online composition. here you can see this better. And so now we will go ahead and discuss the three sort of aspects that I chose for this presentation that I think are important to consider in trying to apply them to modern online distance learning in composition. All right. So the first and the most important part is the reading circles. Now, the reading circles were the heart and soul of Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. They were groups of students studying at a distance. Some were in California, some were in Oregon, some were in Wyoming, and they try to get together and study the materials in their own ways. One of the important things is the institution itself, Chautauqua Institution, is located in upstate New York, near Chautauqua Lake. So these groups allow the students at the distance to study without, to have collaborative learning experience without being present in Chautauqua itself. Although Chautauqua did have a summer part of the program where some people were able to attend. But the important things about these reading circles is they were self-formed. In other words, Chautauqua founders and Chautauqua management did not make anybody join a circle, right? It was not part of the original plan. It was something that sprung up on its own. Members from different parts of the country would get together with others, and they would form this. They would form the study circle. Sometimes they were just small families. As I say here, it's the size varied. Sometimes it was very small family circles where family members would get together, especially if it was extensive family. Sometimes it was just knitting clubs or other types of clubs that were already doing something else. Perhaps it was a church Bible study groups, but that would also now convert and study the materials for the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle coursework. Sometimes these were completely newly formed organizations. Sometimes they were huge. Many people, sometimes hundreds of people would be part of the bigger urban circles and would use the circles in many social ways outside of just the reading. But those are the important part, and that's what I think is one of the things that disconnect that's missing. The idea of being part of a group, of sharing your educational experiences with others, is often missing in modern online learning, web learning, especially for composition. This is important, especially when we consider Bruffy's ideas of writing as a conversation. In other words, of writing, of conversation being an important step in learning to write. In collaborative learning, Bruffy's idea of collaborative learning and conversation, which kind of go hand in hand, but collaborative learning, solving problems with others, participating in that discussion sort of is a training. It's a training for learning to write, for being able to anticipate how others will react to your writing, for being able to foresee some of the objections, for being able to learn how to think through problems and ideas. And this conversation piece is very important, especially in social constructionist view of knowledge. That knowledge is not something that's external. It's something that's created by a social group, and there is this social group that accepts what knowledge is or isn't. And when some something that somebody presents is in line with that socially accepted view, or it's not. Some of the modern web technology, as we talked about earlier, we can use asynchronous and synchronous communication technologies in order for students to work on collaborative projects, also to form their groups with others, perhaps other classes that are working on similar ideas. And we already discussed different forms, but there is discussion boards, forums, wikis. Wikis in particular, I think, are very promising. Synchronous, there is chat, voice over IP, which is sort of phone calls over the internet. And then there is full video web conferencing, which is as close to being together in one room as it can be over the web. I think all of these ways offer some promise in how student groups can work together to learn academic writing. The second practice that I think is very important is the practice of memorial days or rituals. It was conceived by one of the founders of CLSC, Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, John Vincent. And John Vincent recognized that it was important for people to not just to feel that their work was not superficial, that they were doing something of importance, that their work had impact outside of the class. And so he wanted them to feel connected to larger academic community, and as well as to each other, to others who were across the country or even across the world who were studying the same thing. Memorial Days, these rituals became a part of that. So sometimes they were important days for organizations, such as Recognition Day, which took place in Chautauqua Institution and was always full of songs and recitations, speeches. There was a procession, so it was very ceremonious and connected everyone together. For example, in Chautauqua, they had a bell tower that would ring during these Memorial Days to sort of, and the idea was for everyone, no matter where they were, to feel connected to that sound on that day. Sometimes they would celebrate important historical or literary figures, the ones they were studying for that year. Example I give here is Milton Day, but they also had Shakespeare Day. They had others that celebrated Cicero Day, for example, I believe was one of them, that celebrated important historical or literary figures that they were studying. And I think it's important to consider for trying to do something similar for the current modern web courses. If people feel that there is days of recognition, of recognizing important figures, then that they could feel that what they're studying is more important outside of just the class. It was celebrated through established rituals by the reading circle. Sometimes they would invite guest speakers to speak to the circle. Sometimes they would have a certain place. For example, they would have a play that reproduced Roman trials, and they would have, in other words, role play. They would role play Roman trials, and this was part of the ritual of some of the circles that would, again, get them the feeling of being connected to this larger idea that they were working on. And so this has become an important part of Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, that connected them to others who were part of the circle, but also to larger academic community. And the theory behind this, as I said, connection to larger academic community is Bartholomew, right? So the more the student learns to what's important, the values and sort of specifics, preferences of academic community, the more they'll be capable of communicating with that community, the more they can write about something that's important to that community in a way that their audience would be able to understand and relate to. And this is sort of the idea behind. It's not just changing what people write, it's actually giving them an access to being one of the insiders of the academic community. And once they are, then they're capable of speaking as an insider to their colleagues in a way that actually has meaningful implications for academic writing. And Bruffy as well, Bruffy saw this as a transition. He has a piece where he describes the transition as almost being an acceptance of a new culture, of sort of going from popular culture into academic culture, and of doing so in these transition communities, these transition groups, which I think is relevant here. If these groups have their own rituals, then they become much more cemented as a group, as a part of a larger community. So what are some of the technologies we can employ with this? Well, we can use social media websites such as Flickr and Twitter in order to establish some electronic rituals for celebrating some important academic holidays, such as National Writing Day, but also perhaps for celebrating some holidays that are important to that class or that group, such as completion of the first half of the semester, or completion of a first major assignment. And again, I think instructors can be very creative in how they choose these celebrations. They don't necessarily need to be anything extraordinary, but I think the important point is for everybody in the class to participate in the ritual equally in order to feel this connection, and in order to feel that legitimacy of what they're doing outside of the class. After all, we do participate in holidays, and celebrations are an integral part of any culture. And so by establishing these classroom holidays and celebrations, some linking students to larger academic community, some linking them to each other, it's a big step in getting the students to accept academic culture and be accepted by it. Because, as I said earlier, these are collaboratively written websites where students work together to create and construct them. I think are very useful. They can become part of this ritual. Students in fact can create their own ritual and then perhaps pass it on to other classes in the future through these wikis, by creating a sort of teaching wiki to teach these rituals to others. And I already said celebrating classroom accomplishments. Final piece of this is the literary magazine which they had, which was called Chautauqua. And as I said before, it was published by the institution, Chautauqua Institution, and it was sent out from upstate New York, where the institution was, to everybody who was taking the course. So as they were signing up for the course, they would also sign to receive this literary magazine. And it served as another connection tool for the reading circles. They could share best practices with each other. They could share some of the advances that they've had in their circle, some of the things that worked or didn't. But they could also share news of people joining, or people taking the circle, starting new circles, of people other important accomplishments could be shared in this magazine. Another thing that it did is it allowed for scholars and academics to comment on some of the readings that we're doing. They could read how others, it was a form of published criticism that allowed the students to see how other scholars looked at some of the materials they were reading. But they also published some of the assigned readings in this, so it reduced the cost of the textbooks because they could print this themselves and distribute it across the country and sometimes across the world, and it ensured that everybody was reading the same material, that there weren't any sort of large discrepancies, that everyone could rely that it was the same edition and the same material. Another reason is that sometimes certain textbooks were simply not available in some parts of the country. Certain parts in the end of the 19th century, which is when this is happening, end of the 19th century, when the institution started, simply didn't have bookstores, or they had bookstores that didn't carry the books that were necessary. This actually becomes later one of the moving factors behind the establishment of the public library system. But at this stage, there are no public libraries, and so, especially when we consider that there were some circles as far away as Japan, that definitely would have a hard time getting these textbooks, and so the publication of the magazine definitely eased that significantly, right? And it allowed, and again, it continued to allow circles to be part of this mutual project of self-education that was their overall larger goal. It was part of the collaborative learning that Bruffy advocates, in the sense that of the sharing, in the sense that the students, the circle members shared the ideas between each other. So some of the ways we can replicate that is perhaps electronic newsletters now, or maybe even podcasts, right? So these don't necessarily have to be written, but the idea of everybody receiving them at once, perhaps once a month, could definitely make a big difference in terms of how connected students feel. Open source electronic textbooks. Now, this is something that's already happening. For example, Coursera right now they are not, they're in a way very different than what I'm talking about. They're a massive open online system, which I do not condone, but they are partnering now with an open source textbook publisher. So open source textbooks are significantly less expensive than other textbooks, and they're much more accessible pretty much to anyone with an internet access, making it more realistic for students in various parts of the country or even parts of the world to have access to them. And of course, other web publications as well could be used to fulfill similar purpose that the Chautauqua Literary magazine fulfilled. So that is the practices. Now we will simply summarize some things, and I will go over some of the sources I've used in this presentation. So you have already seen most of this presentation, so we will go ahead and go from where we left off. So, as I discussed, I want to emphasize again that the key parts of this are that it changes the dynamic of the classroom, the dynamic of the relationships between the students and the instructor, and between each of the students individually, thus allowing them to take part in a greater social project rather than merely performing academic work that may get them credentials but doesn't necessarily give them a sense of being an insider, a sense of this ability to solve problems together collaboratively and partner with others in order to establish social learning communities and to promote social and academic learning, and thus allowing that to influence their writing, allowing that insight to work in order for them to learn not just the writing piece of composition, but also the larger academic discourse, and to become a part of the discourse. Thank you so much. Let me go over some of the sources you may want to look at for this presentation. So some of the sources, one is the video that I did not show you, but you can check it out for yourself. You can see the information on it here. It's called Hall of Philosophy. It's performed by an archivist at Chautauqua Institution, John Schmitz. You can see the YouTube video. The other one is the editorial I mentioned, New York Times. You can read this. It's about a variety of online courses and how they may not be applicable to introductory courses, how the massive online education model may not work very well for courses such as introductory composition. And then, of course, this is a good article that summarizes the Chautauqua idea, written by one of the founders for a British publication, Contemporary Review by Vincent John, and you can find it on Google Books. It's you can easily access it for more information. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I hope you found this useful.